Dr. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's chief archaeologist, has been studying the pyramids for years. With the discovery of King Scorpion's tomb, he now believes these iconic monuments owe a major debt to the ideas that first took shape in pre-dynastic Egypt.
Without this period, we'll not see the great monuments of pyramids and tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And this is why I really think that pre-dynastic period built Egypt.
And now there is growing evidence linking the Scorpion King to the birth of one of the hallmarks of civilization: writing. Scattered inside King Scorpion's tomb, Günter Dreyer found about 180 small ivory tags. Each one was inscribed with mysterious images. Some obviously animals, others less clear. The implications are staggering.
When we found the first of these little tags in the sand filling of the chambers, we couldn't believe it. Because at the first glance, they resemble later hieroglyphs, but we knew writing only from a much later period, 200 years later. Could it be possible, was our question, that they knew writing already?
Hieroglyphs use both meaning and sound signs, which combine to form words. The pharaohs used hieroglyphs as the language of their kingdom for thousands of years. But no one had ever found any sign of hieroglyphs predating the pharaohs. It had always been thought that the idea of writing first arose not in North Africa, but in the Middle East, in ancient Mesopotamia. Here, by the time of the first pharaohs, a system of accounting, now called cuneiform, had already developed into writing. In Tomb Uj, which predates the pharaohs, each of the tags had a hole in it, suggesting it had once been attached either to the wooden boxes, whose remains were found nearby, or to other containers.
What could be the use of such labels? Just decoration? Not very likely. They had been fixed with these holes to something, and it was most likely that they transferred some information. So we started to understand them and to read them.
The breakthrough came when Dreyer found tags that made sense as hieroglyphs. One showed a stork and a seat.
What could be the meaning? Seated stork? Not very likely. But we know from later hieroglyphic writing, they represent phonetic values, phonetic sounds. The stork would be read Ba. The seat, Set. Together we could read Ba Set. And that, in fact, is the name of a city in the delta.
Ba Set was an ancient city over 300 miles to the north of Abydos. Dreyer now found other tags that could also be read as Egyptian place names.
The important thing is, this is phonetic writing. Signs represent sounds of a language. And that's a major step in developing of writing. And these are the earliest examples of such phonetic writing, much earlier than what we know from Mesopotamia.
It means that the oldest piece of writing ever found is Egyptian. Dreyer's discovery is momentous.
And it shows the birth of civilization came with writing to Egypt long time before we thought. That was the beginning of writing.
The Scorpion King may well have presided over the birth of phonetic writing 200 years before the first pharaohs and earlier than any other civilization in the world. Dreyer thinks his kingdom had grown so large that hieroglyphs were invented to help bind it together.
Imagine an early ruler. He collects taxes. But when he is reigning over a larger area, he runs into problems if they don't take record of who sent what when.
Dreyer believes the tags were inscribed with the names of the cities and estates that sent their goods as taxes to the king. The decoding of these symbols has opened an incredible new window on the past.
We don't know about events or persons, rulers, without writing. And what we learned from Tomb Uj, the Scorpion, King Scorpion's tomb, we regained 250 years of history of mankind.
The tags also reveal that the Scorpion King's influence reached far beyond his own territory in the south. As well as the hieroglyph for Ba Set, Dreyer found the name of a second city in the north, Buteau. Built on what was once the Mediterranean coast, recent excavations are confirming that this was a thriving trade hub with access to markets in the east. And it may have been vital to King Scorpion's interests. Many of the wine jars in his tomb came from outside Egypt, 500 miles from Abydos, in ancient Palestine.
No, he had trade relations to the Near East, to Palestine. And he must have been able to safeguard this trade route. So his influence must have been considerable.
So it seems the Scorpion King oversaw a critical period of Egyptian history. Not only was trade bringing north and south closer together, but the seeds were being sown for the glories that followed.
In Dynasty Zero, all the fundamental building blocks of ancient Egyptian civilization were first put in place. Notions of kingship, of authority, of control of the economy, of religion and art and architecture. It's in Dynasty Zero that these fundamentals are really put in place for the first time.
But now new evidence is suggesting that King Scorpion may have inherited a world far more sophisticated than was previously thought. Ancient Egypt. Traditionally, scholars thought this sophisticated society had arisen so suddenly, the pharaohs must have come from somewhere else.
Egyptologists looking at the great achievements of the pharaohs couldn't bring themselves to believe that Egyptian civilization had been created by North Africans, by the Egyptians themselves. They thought it must have been brought to Egypt from a more enlightened land, as they saw it, to the east, perhaps modern Mesopotamia.
Recent discoveries relating to the Scorpion King are showing just how wrong the early scholars were. A scene carved on a desert rock face suggests he played a key role in uniting the cities of Egypt 200 years before the first pharaoh. And the discovery of his tomb revealed evidence that some of the greatest achievements of Egyptian culture, the birth of writing and the invention of the pyramid, may have had their roots in his reign. The Scorpion King's existence was first discovered a century ago at the ancient city of Hierakonpolis in southern Egypt. Fresh excavations here are giving a remarkable new insight into his world. It appears to have been far more advanced than experts ever thought. The team of archaeologists is led by Dr. Renee Friedman. She's found proof that there was already a mighty city here centuries before the Scorpion King.
We know that it spread for at least 3 kilometers along the edge of what is now the low desert, and we know it continued well into the cultivated zone. So it was a busy, bustling place.
In the time of the pharaohs, the patron god of Hierakonpolis was Horus, the falcon god who was also the emblem of kingship. But Friedman has discovered an artifact that proves this god was being worshipped here hundreds of years before.
And this is the earliest datable statue of Horus, of a falcon, that we know of from pre-dynastic Egypt. It's really, really great to find one here.
Friedman has dated the falcon to 700 years before the first pharaohs. Her team have made other finds from the same period. They too are the earliest examples of their kind. One of the pharaohs' hallmarks was their centralized production of food and drink. Rations were then distributed to the people as pay or handouts. Evidence that this system was in place much earlier at Hierakonpolis has emerged with the discovery of an industrial-scale catering operation.
In the center would have been a large ceramic vat that would have stood about this tall, perhaps, and supporting it and suspending it up above the ground were these fire bars. And they have these fishtail ends, and they're arranged kind of on an angle, and then they would be cemented to the pot. So It stays absolutely still. And then fire is added around the sides. So what you're getting is a low, even heat.
7 more huge vats filled the gully. Walls of mud and pottery fragments enclosed the space, making sure the heat didn't escape. The final product was another surprise.
We get this residue. It's just essentially burnt sugars. Imagine taking sugar and burning it to the bottom of your pot. That's what we're getting. But we've done the starch analysis on it, and we can see that the starches have been fermented. So we know for sure that what they're making here is beer.
Beer made from bread was a staple part of the Egyptian diet in the time of the pharaohs. And it's clear there was already a huge demand in ancient Hierakonpolis.
The brewery, with at least 8 vats, would have made over 1,000 gallons of beer every time it was in use. And it's estimated it could be brewing beer every 2 days. It's more than just what one family might need.
The brewery is one of 2 discovered so far. Both are next door to bakeries and potteries, all part of one well-thought-out production process. King Scorpion was buried with plentiful supplies of beer in his tomb. Perhaps he inherited and used the same centralized system of production. For Friedman, it's further proof that Egypt began much earlier than anyone had ever thought.
No one had expected this kind of advanced civilization at this period, and it continued to be a real question, both in our minds and other people's. Well, who's running the show then?
Not far from the breweries, the city of the Falcon God is yielding up a spectacular answer. Friedman has uncovered the foundations of a tomb complex. It's the burial ground of the ancient king of Hierakonpolis.
This is the largest tomb of its time period yet known, and that time period is about 3800 BC. It's 5.5 meters by 3 meters, so it's 2 to 3 times larger than anything we've ever known.
The excavations are revealing building projects on a monumental scale. King Scorpion's ancestors may have lived among them, and they could also have inspired the massive architecture of the pharaohs. Around the tomb are holes which once held wooden columns. One base is still intact, an extraordinary 6 millennia later. It's made from acacia wood, a sign that trees once grew in this barren landscape. The posts were embedded to a depth of almost 5 feet. Friedman believes they were meant to support a huge structure.
You may be looking at something that's 6 meters above ground. An acacia tree at full size can grow to be 10 meters. So it could be something quite dramatic.
The span between the posts suggests they were designed to take a roof, possibly of reed matting. Fragments of red plaster and cedarwood from the Middle East point to walls expensively finished and decorated with colourful designs.
To imagine these tall structures with this splash of color must have been really impressive, a real sight to be seen. And it also sets the stage for the monumentality that we see later in Egypt. I mean, they're limited by their materials. You can only build so big in wood, but when you move on to brick, when you move on to stone, the sky's the limit.
Inside the tomb itself, excavators found objects that prefigure some of the classic works of art commissioned by the pharaohs. They include the nose and ears from Egypt's earliest life-size statue and ceramic burial masks.
You're trying to protect your head, you're trying to protect your face for eternity. So they are the precursors of the gilded masks, the mask of Tutankhamun with its gold and its lapis lazuli incrustations. This is where it all began.
Just yards from the tomb, the archaeologists found the remains of a second wooden structure. This was also a clear prototype for the stone architecture of the pharaohs.
So over here we have what must be a funerary temple, the earliest in Egypt, like everything here. It's a whole area where there's no graves, but we have these large pillared halls. Imagine a forest of columns rising up.
With a design similar to the tomb but on a much larger scale, this was a sophisticated structure that would have stunned those who walked through it.
Again, we also know that there was color. We have plaster on the walls. We have red, we have green, we have figural decorations. So imagine walking into something like that, standing proud in this wadi.
This was the direct ancestor of the monumental hyper-style hall at Karnak, built some 2,000 years later.
And again, it's an architectural form we never imagined for this period. We always thought that came in with stone architecture. But it's clearly all derived from these very, you can't say they're primitive anymore, these actually very sophisticated wooden buildings.
Excavations have revealed an entire royal cemetery, a sacred enclosure full of tombs and temples. It's now clear that Scorpion and the kings of Dynasty Zero built on the achievements of the rulers buried here.
Kings that were once considered to be the first, the earliest, are now clearly just the heirs to a long tradition of development and innovation that began 500 years before they were even born.
The finds at Hierakonpolis may help experts to imagine the city King Scorpion would have lived in. Now archaeologists are seeing clues in his intriguing royal regalia that could take the history of Egypt even further back in time. Inside the tomb, which may once have held the body of King Scorpion, archaeologists found a crooked scepter, a precursor of one buried with King Tutankhamun 18 centuries later. Experts now see it as a sign that Egyptian culture may have had its earliest roots in a surprising place, the desert. Today, most of Egypt's population is crammed into the narrow strip of cultivated land that borders the Nile. To the east and west lie large swathes of arid desert. In one of its least explored areas, the Eastern Sahara, Rudolf Cooper has been collecting evidence of human activity. He believes that rock art here predates the pharaohs by thousands of years, and the carvings depict the impossible: elephants in the middle of the desert.
You see the tail, you see the legs, you see the tusks here, and then the long, long trunk ending here. I think a picture of an elephant here in the desert seems to be like a miracle.
The explanation: climate change. Around 10,000 BC, monsoon rains transformed the Sahara from a desert into a fertile land, home to elephants, ostriches, and many other animals that have long since vanished from the region.
The plants came, the animals followed, and finally man followed the animals. These people were hunters, gatherers, and fishers.
Rock art also seems to show that later, around 3,000 years before the pharaohs, the hunters of the Sahara turned into herdsmen of cattle, sheep, and goats. Cooper has found traces of these nomads scattered across the vast desert. But despite centuries of excavation, there's hardly any evidence of human beings living at this time in the Nile Valley.
The reason might be that the environment in the Nile Valley was too moist, and that there were a lot of illnesses and so on, that people didn't like to live there.
But then the rains dried up once more. The savanna began changing back into desert. The nomads began moving out. 1,000 years before the pharaohs, and they had mostly gone, spanning out in all directions through Africa. At the same time, settlements are found springing up in the Nile Valley, now no longer too damp and unhealthy. This period of climate change and migration could explain why Egyptian civilization arose when it did.
We might call the desiccation of the Sahara a motor of Africa's history.
It seems those who headed east to the Nile Valley took their desert culture with them.
They brought with them not only their economy, and their way of living, they also brought with them their beliefs, their ideologies. And maybe some of this can be traced back even in the religion of ancient Egypt.
The nomadic herdsmen of the desert, so close to their animals, were perhaps the origin of some of the most important symbols of the pharaoh's power.
The classic pharaonic regalia of the crook and the goad, two items used in animal husbandry, take us back to those prehistoric origins of ancient Egyptian rulers as cattle herders.
Before the pharaohs, the Scorpion King was also buried with a crook carved in ivory. And this wasn't the only herder's emblem he passed on to his successors.
From the Scorpion King and the Nama palette onwards, one of the key items of royal regalia worn in the pharaoh's waistband was a bull's tail, a symbol of virility and of animal power. And again, it casts us back to that prehistoric period of cattle herding. 2,400
years ago, the Greek historian Herodotus described Egypt as the gift of the Nile. Cooper believes that's just half the story.
If we include the results from the desert, one might perhaps say Egypt is also, not completely, but also the gift of the desert.
These discoveries are completing the work begun by James Quibell, who first revealed the Scorpion King's existence a century ago. He was among the first to question the common assumption that a superior race arrived from outside to kick-start Egyptian civilization. Now a very different picture has emerged.
Egypt no longer seems to arise as if from nowhere with the pyramids or with the First Dynasty, but we can trace its origins right back into prehistory, and it puts a whole new light on the development of civilization in North Africa.
The search for the Scorpion King has revealed a man who was a pivotal figure in the creation of ancient Egypt.
He was a mysterious king, but now we can really see what he did, what kind of things that he achieved, and we can see a real man in front of us.
He built on the achievements of earlier cultures, epitomized by the great city of Hierakonpolis. He helped unify Egypt through trade and battle.
The events that Scorpion's union of Upper Egypt sets in motion really set the stage for much of what we think of as the main elements of pharaonic civilization.
He organized his kingdom with the world's earliest phonetic writing system. He began a new style of burial that may have inspired the complex tombs and pyramids of the pharaohs. Now at last, experts are discovering the true origins of ancient Egypt and the remarkable legacy of the Scorpion King.